Hello, my name is Dr. Hehir and I'm a reader in international relations at the University of Westminster. My primary research interest is humanitarian intervention, and today I'm going to talk to you about the issue of humanitarian intervention in general, and I'm going to start with a lecture on what is humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention is something that's widely discussed in international relations, and not just by academics. It's also invoked by world leaders. A couple of examples of that: in 1999, when the United States intervened in Kosovo, President Bill Clinton, the US president at the time, described it as a moral imperative. In 2003, President George W. Bush told the people of Iraq prior to the invasion in March 2003, "The day of your liberation is near." And in 2011, President Barack Obama said that he was motivated to act with respects to Libya because he wanted to prevent mass graves and human slaughter. So this is something that has a real world influence. It's an extremely controversial, extremely interesting topic, and it is something that has fixated many people for many years. But one of the great, I would say unique aspects of humanitarian intervention is it's not just academically interesting, it's also an issue that is very emotive, and it has a real world impact. We're talking about real lives and human suffering. It's also extremely controversial. In 1939, Hitler justified his invasion of Czechoslovakia essentially as a humanitarian intervention. I mentioned previously the controversy surrounding the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, when they framed the invasion as a humanitarian intervention, calling the military Operation Iraqi Freedom. And in addition to those suspicions that humanitarian intervention is a cover for just aggression, there is the ongoing question about its record. Does it actually work? Our most recent example of humanitarian intervention is Libya in 2011. And of course, the aftermath of the intervention was pretty much a disaster. And that led many people to think, well, does this actually work? And if you look back in history, there aren't too many examples of humanitarian intervention working particularly well. In terms of the history of the concept, it's discussed in the modern era as a debate between those who prioritize human security and state security. Now, it hasn't always been framed that way, but people have talked about human rights and the relationship between the citizen and the government for millennia. This particular tradition that is most relevant to humanitarian intervention, that goes back thousands of years, is what's known as the just war tradition. And this is an attempt by various different people from various different backgrounds and eras to determine when is it right to use force. What are the circumstances when it is okay to actually use force? And it stems from, in particular, Western Christian tradition. And it started as an attempt to try to figure out, well, if we're Christians and we believe in what Jesus said in the Bible, can we use force? And initially, Christians believed that no, you had to be a pacifist. But over time, that began to alter, and you had some very key figures like St. Augustine and St. Aquinas, who were obviously saints and religious figures, who tried to determine, well, is there a way that we can justify the use of force and still be Christians? And that's what the just war tradition, at least initially, attempted to do. Now, the just war tradition is not absolutely applicable to humanitarian intervention, because it's not just about saving people in other states, but it certainly has been used many times in the contemporary era to try to bolster thinking around what is humanitarian intervention and when is it legitimate. The problem with the just war tradition, obviously, is that, as I said, it's very much Western, it's very Christian orientated, and ultimately it was largely contrived during a time when there weren't international laws and there wasn't the state system that we have today. And therefore its applicability in the modern era is somewhat limited. In terms of thinking about humanitarian intervention in the modern era, and by that I mean the era when we've had the consolidation of state sovereignty and the emergence of international law, in the aftermath of the First World War, the League of Nations was established in an attempt to prevent war. Now, as we know, it didn't work particularly well, but at least these initiatives set a standard that said, well, war isn't something that we should just accept. In previous eras, it was considered to be almost like a natural disaster. You couldn't stop it, it was inevitable. But after the First World War, there was a general sense that, well, we can't tolerate this. Let's try to ensure that we say this is outlawed. Now, as I said, obviously the Second World War came along, but nonetheless, after the Second World War, that resolve to prevent warfare, to limit it at least, was redoubled. And we had the UN established in 1945, and the UN Charter in particular put great emphasis again on prescribing, making it illegal for states to go to war. The UN Charter also mentions human rights. Now, as I'll talk about in the lecture on international law, these references to human rights and self-determination are fleeting and not particularly detailed, but it certainly started a process in the post-World War II era whereby international law regarding human rights began to grow. Obviously, we had the Genocide Convention in the aftermath of the Second World War, and in particular in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And in general, throughout the Cold War, despite everything that was happening, there was this widening and deepening of international law regarding human rights. The problem, of course, and again I'll speak more about that when we come to international law, was the inability to enforce these laws. So the UN General Assembly created lots of different laws about human rights, but throughout the Cold War period, because you had this stalemate at the UN Security Council, it was impossible to get any agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States, these laws couldn't be enforced. So they were essentially dead letters in many respects. Now, when the Cold War ended, this changed everything. And this led to a huge amount of optimism about the spread of liberal democracy, the spread of capitalism. It was the end of history. There was this what's called the era of unipolarity. The United States was so dominant it could do anything and it would spread all these good things around the world. And one aspect of the optimism that prevailed at the time related directly to humanitarian intervention. And this was the notion that in the new era, it would now be possible for the UN to actually collectively respond to intrastate crises. If people were suffering overseas, the UN now, freed from the Cold War stalemate, could actually take action. There was also a sense that the non-Western world wanted to be more like the West, and they would try to reform internally and democratize, and that process itself would ensure human rights protection around the world. And there was a third view, which was that, well, even if the UN Security Council refuses to act in the face of a humanitarian crisis, the West is so powerful now that it can act unilaterally, and it won't trigger a third world war. There was also the emergence of a new group in the post-Cold War era called global civil society, which is this loose collection of actors who overwhelmingly focused on promoting human rights around the world. And they felt, and many people agreed with them, that they would be able to put pressure on states to do the right thing, to ensure respect for human rights domestically, but also they could put pressure on states, Western states, to intervene internationally to protect the human rights of people in other states. So if you had a situation whereby people were being subjected to genocide or crimes against humanity in a country in Africa or Eastern Europe or Asia, Western states would be asked by global civil society activists to do something about that. And because Western states are inherently liberal and care about human rights anyway, and because they are receptive to appeals from within their own general public because they're democracies, the idea was these people will respond to this plea from global civil society. In that sense then, humanitarian intervention enters what many people described as a kind of a golden era when the Cold War ended. Up to the Cold War, people certainly did write, up to the end of the Cold War, people certainly did write and talk about humanitarian intervention, but it really exploded as an issue amongst academics and journalists and policymakers after the Cold War ended. Now, what is it? It's very clear that it looks like certain other types of actions, but it does have a particular meaning and definition, and there are certain things it demonstrably is not. The first thing to say that it isn't humanitarian aid. Humanitarian intervention has to involve the use of military force. So, for example, an organisation like Oxfam or Save the Children or the Red Cross, they are humanitarian actors and they do intervene in other countries, but we don't call that humanitarian intervention. We call that the provision of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian intervention essentially must involve the use of military force. Secondly, it's not UN peacekeeping. Again, similar kind of an idea. You have troops from outside a country intervening in a country to do good things. But the key difference between humanitarian intervention and UN peacekeeping is that UN peacekeeping has to be mandated by the UN Security Council and also has to have the consent of the host state. Humanitarian intervention needn't have either of those two things. A humanitarian intervention can be one that isn't mandated by the UN Security Council, and it also is one, and always must be one, whereby the host state doesn't want the outside party to intervene. Clearly Gaddafi didn't want the coalition to intervene in 2011. So there must be the absence of consent. And finally, it is not just ordinary war. Humanitarian intervention has to be different to war. If one state invades another state and says, I'm doing this purely to get access to oil or resources or something like that, or self-defense, that can't be called a humanitarian intervention. The key difference is that humanitarian intervention is justified to some extent, and this is where it gets controversial, by a concern for people suffering human rights abuses in another state. So there is a humanitarian element to the rationale. Now, in terms of a composite definition, in the textbook I wrote about humanitarian intervention, I looked at all the existing definitions and tried to pull them together and come up with one that essentially drew upon all the key elements of the other definitions. And this is what I said. Humanitarian intervention is military action taken by a state, group of states, or non-state actor in the territory of another state without that state's consent, which is justified to some significant extent by humanitarian concern for the citizens of the host state. Now, as much as that's my definition, it certainly isn't perfect, and there are aspects of it that are contentious and are, fuzzy. Okay, if you were a lawyer looking at that definition, you would say, well, what does that mean? There's parts of it that are inherently vague, particularly the final part where I say justified to some significant extent. What does that mean? Later on, I'll talk specifically about motives. But the key thing to bear in mind for the moment is that humanitarian intervention ultimately doesn't require the consent of the UN Security Council. It certainly doesn't require the consent of the host state. It must involve military action, and it must involve troops moving from one state into another state.